But despite a firm grip on power and a fair degree of international respect, in December 1960, there was an attempt to overthrow him. Here's Alex Last.
In December 1960, while Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, was out of the country, his security chiefs attempted a coup. The first sign of the plot came with the sudden disappearance of Ethiopia's crown prince, Haile Selassie's son and the presumptive heir.
It started on a Tuesday evening. Very late, my father was called by the crown princess, who said, "My husband has not been here for hours."
Asrate, a grandnephew of the emperor, was then 12 years old. His father was Prince Asrate Kassa, a senior member of the imperial family.
My father went immediately to the crown prince's palace, and they found out that something fishy was going on. The crown prince had been taken to the headquarters of the imperial bodyguard.
It soon became clear that the commander of the imperial bodyguard was leading a coup. The plot was the brainchild of the commander's brother, a reformist administrator, and they were aided by the imperial security chief and the head of the police. That night, they took top government officials hostage. But young Asfawassan's father, Prince Asrate, had slipped through the net. He was fiercely loyal to the emperor and was determined to resist the coup.
The first thing he did was to go to the British embassy at the early hours of the Wednesday morning in a very small Volkswagen, because also the cars of my father were known in the city, to transmit what had happened, that a coup had taken place to the emperor, who was in Brazil, which he did.
Haile Selassie, Emperor of Ethiopia, once again occupies the focal point of world interest. Now, conspirators in his capital have tried to overthrow him. Since the pre-war days of the brief conquest of Ethiopia by Mussolini, Haile Selassie has retained the affection of millions throughout the world.
By that time, the 68-year-old Ethiopian emperor had already been on the throne for 30 years.
What was unbelievable about him were his eyes that were really penetrating, and he had an aura that surrounded him that completely made you forget how short he was. He was a kind, warm-hearted person, a patriarch. That is, I think, the right word to describe him. He considered every Ethiopian subject his children.
Haile Selassie was once seen as a reformer and modernizer himself, open to ideas from the West. Yet he was steeped in the traditions of the ancient Ethiopian monarchy and his Orthodox Christian faith. In some ways, he was an absolutist monarch at a time when many felt the country desperately needed serious political, economic, and agrarian reform. And it was his reluctance to change that had persuaded the plotters he needed to be replaced. Within hours of the coup, most of the key installations in the capital, Addis Ababa, were in the hands of the imperial bodyguard, an elite force around 5,000 strong.
On the Wednesday, my father ordered the servants in our house to put us in a car and bring us very, very early to the Crown Prince's palace. It was a lovely day, I still remember it. And then, of course, we started to play with our cousins there.
And then came a dramatic broadcast on the radio.
We heard the Crown Prince's voice saying that the new government had taken over, and things started to get a bit fishy.
Crown Prince Asfawassan, in the present coup d'etat, was reported to have been made emperor in his father's place. The Crown Prince was compelled, say his friends, to obey the handful of revolutionaries and to be declared Emperor of Ethiopia.
As children interpret those things, I said, hurrah! I'm staying in the Crown Prince's house, and you hear that the Crown Prince had become the Emperor of Ethiopia, you know? And of course you felt, my God, what a wonderful thing, you know? But you could not see the joy in the eyes of those who heard it, you know, the grown-ups. Why are they not happy? Why is not everybody celebrating, you know?
What was the Crown Prince like?
I always thought he was a very kind person, the late Crown Prince, a very gentle person.
Do you think he was willing to play the role that he did during the coup?
He made it very clear to us in 1974. He said that he undoubtedly not only knew about the revolution ahead of time, he was also part of the people had organized it.
Some university students demonstrated in support of the coup, but by this time, young Asfawasan's father, Prince Asrate, had got together with a top Ethiopian army general to rally support for the emperor. The regular army stayed loyal, as did the air force, and crucially, the Orthodox Church said anyone involved in the coup would be excommunicated. And when the fight came, it was not an even one. The bodyguard were outnumbered and outgunned.
All Thursday you heard a lot of firing. You could even hear cannons. And later on you could also hear aeroplanes who had come and were diving very low. And I shall never forget the Crown Princess then came and she brought us, each and every one of us, into the cellar in the main house. I suppose she wouldn't trust anybody else. I will never forget her taking each and every one of us by hand into the safety of the cellar. And then on Friday morning, we had a lot of firing. The forces of the Imperial Army were coming through the gates of the Gennetalul Palace, where the revolutionaries had taken members of the imperial government as hostages.
But just before they were overrun, the plotters opened fire on their hostages, killing 15 top government officials.
They just went and killed them all. Some of the most senior people who had done so much for the liberation of Ethiopia. It was a dastardly thing to do. 2 taboos were broken. You cannot kill people without due process of law. That taboo was broken. And for the first time, the authority of the Ethiopian emperor had been questioned.
In total, it's estimated that between 2,000 to 3,000 died during the fighting in Addis Ababa. Most of the leading conspirators were killed, committed suicide, or were later executed. The Crown Prince survived. It was said he acted under duress, but for years, the doubts remained.
For a brief time, no one could tell whether Haile Selassie and the Empress would ever dwell in the palace again. But overwhelmingly, the people were on his side.
About 20 to 30,000 had gathered at the old airport to welcome the emperor. I distinctly remember that the emperor was coming down the gangway. Then the Crown Prince went to the steps and basically fell on his knees in front of the emperor. I could not tell you what he said to him, but then he stood up. The emperor climbed into his limousine, and we all went to the Jubilee Palace. Much later, I heard from my father that the emperor said to him, well, we would have been very proud of you had we come for your funeral, which meant, of course, you have deceived me.
Emperor Haile Selassie ruled Ethiopia for another 14 years until he was deposed during the bloody Ethiopian Revolution. Dr. Asfawasan Asrate grew up to become a consultant on African and Middle Eastern affairs and a best-selling author. He's just written a new biography of Emperor Haile Selassie called King of Kings.
We did not learn from the experiences we got in 1960. Ethiopia should have learned its lesson, but the emperor was not ready to change anything. And that is the tragedy. When it's too late to reform a country, then the country is ready for a revolution. And that is exactly what happened.
Dr. Asfawasan Asrate was talking to Alex Last. So, was the attempted coup in 1960 simply a power play among the elites in Ethiopia, or was there a sense of a deep-seated popular disquiet with Haile Selassie at the time? Joining me now is Professor Christopher Clapham from the Centre for African Studies at Cambridge University. We heard a news report there, Professor Clapham, stating that overwhelmingly the people were with Haile Selassie. Is that correct?
Yes, that was certainly true at the time. This was a time long before the forces of revolution had really got underway in Ethiopia. The attempted coup came as a massive shock to almost everybody, and although the students who already were starting to become a bit more radical than the rest of the population demonstrated in favour of the attempted coup, most of the population was taken utterly by surprise and instinctively sided with Haile Selassie.
So just expand a little bit on the reasons why there would have been even the germ of popular disquiet. You mentioned the students there, but clearly amongst the elites there was concern.
Yes, the intellectual leader of the coup, a man called Germamed Nouai, had been a student in the United States, This was at a time when very few Ethiopians knew anything much about what was happening in the outside world, and Gadwami certainly got his ideas there, and had the enormous advantage that his brother, Mengistu Noai, was the commander of the emperor's bodyguard. So in terms of personnel, the coup attempt came very much from inside the elite.
But there was a need for a degree of reform, both political, economic, and of course agrarian, which much of the country would have been at the time. Did Haile Selassie learn any lessons from the attempted coup against him?
Haile Selassie was a very smart politician, and his instincts were always to move towards opposition rather than towards repression. And certainly in the years after the attempted coup, he did make some changes that he regarded as reforms, but really the whole system itself was beyond reform already by that point. There's no way in which an emperor, however progressive, steeped in the imperial traditions of Ethiopia, a dedicated member of the Orthodox Church of Ethiopia, someone who had grown up in the palace of his predecessor, the Emperor Menelik, his mind simply couldn't change to the extent that would have been needed to avert much more radical reform.
So, as you say, whatever reforms he might have put in place would never have been enough because of the sort of system that he represented.
Yes, essentially. Students by the early 1970s regarded Haile Selassie and the imperial family and the old history of Ethiopia essentially with contempt. They were aware, as the revolutionaries in 1960 had been aware, of changes taking place in the African continent as a whole. They viewed anyone called an emperor as being entirely out of date, and they had a cause to take up in the form of agrarian reform. Their great slogan was "Land to the farmer." You can see very clear parallels indeed with the French Revolution of 1789 or the Russian Revolution of 1917. There are just sharp limits to what a monarchy founded in its own eyes on the support of God can do to change the system. And essentially that system had to go with the man who had for so long upheld it.
Professor Christopher Clapham from the Centre for African Studies at Cambridge University. And you can see a photo of the Emperor Haile Selassie, complete with those piercing eyes and taken at about the time of the attempted coup in 1960, on our website. Just search for BBC Witness. Now, it can't have escaped your notice that Christmas is nearly upon us. Throughout the Christian world, families will be preparing to celebrate the religious festival representing the birth of Christ. But it's also become a festival of commerce, as the giving of gifts is part of the tradition. And 35 years ago, one of the most popular must-have toys of the time was the Rubik's Cube puzzle. The story of the Rubik's Cube begins, though,